Yeah, hi Flo. Great that we can have this short chat or interview. You had already written a blog post some time ago about Adobe App Builder. Could you please explain again what it's all about? So, what exactly is this technology? What can one imagine by that? And especially, what can you do with it?
In 2021, yes, Adobe App Builder is a part of the Adobe Commerce Reference Architecture. It's basically a reference architecture that Adobe has released to show how future commerce projects can be implemented. Adobe is really focusing on headless front end, also trying to place the commerce core in the cloud, and around that, App Builder comes in to act as a communication vehicle between the headless front end and the commerce cloud. Adobe App Builder is also in the cloud. It's function as a service. You get an infrastructure provided, a development environment basically. Developers can extend commerce, creating features quickly using microservices without PHP coding. These deploy to the cloud, running as functions and integrating into the backend. Not just commerce, but also Adobe Experience Manager, of course. So you can develop features relatively quickly in small functions without having to code in PHP, so-called microservices, which you can then deploy to the cloud and also provide with single-page applications as a small interface. So you can build individual features in the cloud that run as functions there and then integrate them into the commerce backend. And the great thing about it is that you don't have to extend or change anything in the commerce core.
Okay. What are the prerequisites for developers to be able to work with App Builder?
So App Builder itself generally works with JavaScript. You can also develop with TypeScript, which then compiles to JavaScript. We use that quite often. That means anyone who understands JavaScript or knows TypeScript will feel right at home in the environment, can get started right away, and can host everything through a GitHub repository and deploy it immediately. There's a command library at the CLI level that allows you to connect the cloud environment, manage your infrastructure, and deploy your code.
Do you have a specific example of such an App Builder app? Let's just call it that.
There are actually a lot of examples by now. For example, we've already written an order export towards the ERP system, which retrieves, processes, transforms, and validates data via the REST API from Commerce, and then sends it to the ERP system. We also have a brand new project where we're using App Builder, or rather use the underlying I/O runtime as an orchestration layer, because we have a headless front end that wants to access an SAP system. And SAP has inherently more complex interfaces, so with a very large data format, where you have to aggregate data from various services within SAP, orchestrate it, and then return it all together to the front end. That means the front end itself only knows one endpoint. And this endpoint then returns the data collected through App Builder.
Since when has this technology been around? So since when has App Builder been on the market and, more importantly, usable? So it's also being used by service providers like us, but probably not just us, but also by others. Since when has it actually been used in practice?
So if I remember correctly, I think it's been about 3 or 4 years since the first steps were taken with I/O runtime. That's when we looked at it for the first time. It's, of course, always evolving and becoming more mature. And commerce itself is finding more and more ways to expand. So from the outside, webhooks have been added, allowing you to intercept the PHP code, request webhooks, populate them with data, and send events back and forth. In 2021, that means App Builder is also capable of receiving events in a sort of journal system and can process them. And it's getting more mature, more and more stable all the time. And ultimately, it has now also become part of the reference architecture and is a central point in this whole conglomerate.
You just mentioned reference architecture, USAND. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? What does this reference architecture look like in broad terms? What's it all about? What's so special about it?
Ultimately, it's a collaboration of many systems. In this reference architecture, you find an Adobe Experience Manager where you can manage and deliver content, an EDS, which stands for Edge Delivery Service, acting as a headless front end that is incredibly performant and also scores very well in terms of SEO. Definitely, you will find Adobe Commerce. But acting as a headless solution in the cloud, along with the Adobe SaaS services. This includes, for example, catalog service, live search, product recommendations, and so on. Basically, to take all the functionalities out of commerce and shift them to other services. You can tell over time that the architecture is moving towards microservices and will continue to do so. It's going to continue happening like this. And Adobe is now also contributing significantly by, for example, they've now basically released the Adobe Commercial Integration Starter Kit.
Mm-hmm. Here comes the next buzzword. What's the deal with the Commerce Starter Kit?
Exactly. The Starter Kit is basically built on app images. It's a kind of, let's call it a boilerplate framework, which means a rough structure for how communication between commerce and any back office system can take place. That means there are various steps that take place there where events are sent back and forth through different data entities, which are validated, transformed, somehow further processed, and then sent to the underlying back office system. The back office system can be a classic PIM, an ERP system, a CRM system, basically anything you can find in the commerce landscape. And the great thing about it is that everything is already pretty much prepared. This means that the actual development team has been made it easier to start a new project because, well, Adobe says that you only need to do the last mile implementation, the final step, depending on the back office system you want to connect to. So you just need to integrate the interface and implement the data mapping. So the actual implementation is very quick. We connected SAP using this integration starter kit, and we actually managed to do it with 6 people in 3 days, completely.
So he was there with a few colleagues in Barcelona at Adobe. I caught a bit of what was going on the sidelines. At first I thought, oh, the colleagues are on vacation, wonderful. Keep your eyes open when choosing a career. What exactly did you guys do? You already spoiled that a bit.
We ate a lot of tapas, at least 3 times a day. Okay, that was Spanish, and it means something like, tests have to be green before you commit. No, just kidding. We were in Barcelona. Adobe invited us because we've used this integration starter kit quite a lot. And they invited us and wanted to work with us on implementing a back office solution together. So we brought 3 people from our team, and they brought 3 people from theirs. The office in Barcelona is very centrally located. Anyone who's been to Barcelona can probably confirm that it's a really amazing city that you always love to visit again. So we decided to integrate SAP because we already have a lot of SAP know-how from existing and future projects. And it was just the next logical step for us to implement an SAP connector for S/4HANA. It simply doesn't exist yet based on app images. And that was basically a challenge, which we set as a goal to implement it within 3 days. We managed to do it.
Wow. So what does that mean? How should I picture this concretely? So there's now basically a starter kit for SAP S/4HANA. It's basically a kind of basic interface, if you will, that I, as a developer or service provider, or as a business customer using Adobe Commerce with SAP as the backend system, can build upon using this starter kit. I already have, let's say, the basic functionalities and so on. And I can implement my individual SAP interface for S/4HANA faster and more securely, because at the end of the day, the SAP interface has never existed before, since an SAP system is always extremely customized. So there has basically never been a basic interface like this, but this is basically, as I understand it, a basic implementation that you build upon, allowing you to connect your SAP much faster and more efficiently.
Exactly right. So we had an S/4HANA in the cloud that we worked with. We oriented ourselves towards the standard interfaces because there's a growing trend to move towards standard interfaces to remain update compatible. We connected Adobe Commerce to it, and it has become a reference application between SAP and Adobe Commerce based on these interfaces. The communication is completely based on events, meaning both SAP sends out events and Adobe Commerce as well. You can think of it like an event bus or event journal in the middle, where it's represented through app images, where the data is received, transformed, and then sent to the other system. That means, of course, detailed data mapping still needs to be done in the individual projects. That's the part that basically remains the projects. The basic infrastructure is already in place. This means that products from SAP can be created in Commerce, and customers can be created and modified in both directions. Changes are synchronized. We obviously have an order export. We have an order status synchronization throughout the entire lifecycle. And on top of that, we've also integrated webhooks so that, for example, a headless front end is able to load the order history from SAP or perform an order simulation service. That's very classic in SAP 1000.
Yeah, really, really cool. Indeed. How should I picture it if I'm a company that's already using S/4HANA as an ERP system and Adobe Commerce as the shop system, and I want to connect the two systems? Then the data kit you've worked on is basically the foundational connection, if you will, that will be built upon to establish this connection. Can you roughly say how much effort it takes to do such a basic implementation? So are we talking about several days, as you just said, a few weeks or a few months? The question is, of course, difficult to answer because it always depends on how big the company is, how heavily customized it is, what data needs to be transferred at what frequency, and so on. All right. But just to give a bit of a feel for it, because the topic of interfaces has always been one of the trickiest issues in the past, right? Cost drivers, time drivers, and so on.
Yeah, set up relatively quickly. So with an Adobe Commerce license, you also have access to app images, which are included with that license. And the integration starter kit is designed in such a way that you can run onboarding scripts and configure them to say, I want these events from Commerce to be synchronized in SAP. On the SAP side, set up an event mesh quickly. You have queues that send events. It's pure configuration, allowing synchronization of standard entities. The last mile involves specific project requirements, like product data, requiring detailed data mapping. This is manageable in terms of effort. What still needs to be done is really that last mile implementation, where you say, okay, for this specific project, there are special requirements for product data, for example. So you go through the data mapping explicitly and in detail. But that should really be manageable in terms of effort. So, as I said, we needed about 3 days for this implementation. So it will behave in a similar way, of course. It took 3 days, so it will behave in a similar way, of course.
Yeah, that's intense. Now, another question. It's often a requirement in projects to synchronize data in real time or even instantaneously to a certain degree, to some extent. So, for example, I have a web shop, I add various products to the cart, and they are still there regarding stock. But in the BC area, for instance, there are some fast-moving products where sales can quickly drop to zero. I face a problem where products in the cart might be sold out, leading to negative stock levels. Before submitting an order, you check in real time with the ERP system to ensure products are available, avoiding overselling. Can this starter kit do that? That's why it's often the case that before sending the order, you actually query the ERP system in real time to see if the products are actually still there in order to be able to guarantee this short sale or negative sale. Would something like that also be possible with the starter kit? So it would be a separate implementation. It's probably not integrated into the starter kit, but something like that could definitely be relatively easy to implement on the existing base infrastructure, I would say, right?
Definitely, definitely. It's just the existing webhook that we've implemented. It also retrieves the orders from SAP in real time to present an order history to the customer in real time. And the cool thing about it is that until now, you actually had to customize Adobe Commerce, meaning you had to overwrite existing core code to provide the desired logic, as you just mentioned. And then, of course, you always run into the problem that with future Adobe Commerce updates, everything has to be carried over and maintained. Of course, that comes with costs and efforts. And the integration starter kit, or exactly, this SAP connector that we've built allows you to write a webhook, which means a so-called action, that might be 50 to 100 lines of code long, and you can deploy it into your environment, into your cloud, where it will then be executed. So it's an externally callable action that the shop can directly call, for example, about webhook functionalities. And then it can execute an action to, for example, to achieve what you just described, to check if the stock is still available, at what price can I get this, and maybe also to show corrections in the cart, like, for example, only 5 left instead of 10.
Exactly, 2001. Now, another question. Now we've talked about SAP quite a bit, especially in the S. So basically the latest version. 2 questions about that. It's true that SAP is extremely widespread. We all know that. However, it's also available in various versions. So the predecessor is actually the most widely used system version as such. The connector is now available for S/4HANA software. Could I somehow use something from that in terms of backward compatibility? Or is it a completely different ballpark? So that would be the first question. And the second question is, what if there are still companies out there that don't necessarily use SAP as their ERP system, but rather Dynamics or maybe Oracle JD Edwards or something like that? Can they also benefit from this starter kit in any way? Is there a plan to have adaptations for the most common other ERP systems as well?
Yes, so basically S/4HANA and R, fundamentally different. So it's actually not backward compatible. The standard interfaces are just way too different for that. You can't really compare that. That means we'd actually have to go ahead and integrate an R with the basic integration starter kit, which is absolutely no problem. Any other system, an Akineo, Microsoft, whatever. There are already reference implementations available in Adobe Exchange. They can also be used for existing back-office systems accordingly, with the focus being that a lot has already been prepared through the integration starter kit. How this communication workflow is supposed to work, development team or implementers just need to focus on how to integrate the actual system. So you just need to focus on the business logic. You don't have to worry about deployment or infrastructure. Yes, that's actually all already in place and ready to use.
So basically, I have a kind of safety framework within which I can operate to be safe as a developer, if you will.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes, very, very interesting. Now let's move away from the business topic. What was it? I'm assuming you guys definitely implemented for almost 24 hours while you were in Barcelona, because otherwise it wouldn't have been possible in such a short time. What did you guys do in the few hours of free time you had? What was the highlight?
So basically, Spain has a different time zone for me. They're actually 3 hours behind. They start at 9:30 a.m. and don't leave the office until around 7:30 p.m. and it's all pretty relaxed. Meanwhile, someone from Germany, let's say, is already feeling stressed because it's getting dark and wondering when dinner is finally going to be served. That's why they live 3 hours behind for me. What did we basically do outside? We ate a lot, and it's actually surprisingly cool. No matter where you sit down, it always tastes good. You can never really go wrong there. And the office is located quite centrally in Barcelona, so you can get anywhere easily and are right where there's something going on. It's a lot of fun.
So probably won't be in Barcelona for the last time.
Definitely not, no.
So here's a call to Adobe. You'd like to be invited once more again.
Right. We're basically regulars there, I would say. We go there regularly. Exactly. So I think that it will still have a future.
Yeah, very, very cool. And now, let's say turn of the year is just around the corner. In 2025, we have some interesting projects starting and in the pipeline. So, if you take a look into the crystal ball for 2025, what are the topics you're particularly looking forward to, or what do you think will be a big challenge have ahead of us?
In fact, the shift towards this Adobe Commerce Reference Architecture is going to be very exciting. I see 2021 as a central focus for new projects, where you can orient yourself and align the new projects. I'm not saying must, because not every project is suited for that specific level of development. It's always a matter of the level of development, how much of these components you want to use. It's not a law being introduced that every project has to look like that. Rather, it's a guideline, a signpost for where things are headed, and every project is unique. So that's the exciting part for next year, figuring out at what level you can actually apply these modern tools to move more towards a microservice architecture.
Now, one last question about microservice architecture. Headless and so on, I'd say the hype kind of died down a bit in between. In the meantime, it was like the latest trend that everyone was talking about, and everything had to be microservice and headless and whatever else it's called. From my point of view, and history has certainly confirmed this, such new technologies always have two sides. So, of course, you always try to highlight the advantages and the unique aspects, but it's also true that not everything that glitters is gold. So, what do you think are the biggest advantages of microservice architecture, and where do you think there are points or parameters where you need to be a bit cautious? Maybe a microservice architecture isn't necessarily the right fit, even if consultants or the media are all over it saying, hey, everything has to be headless and so on.
In my opinion, the biggest advantages of a microservice architecture are that you have a single point of responsibility. That means you have individual services where you can implement features in 2021, and their only job is to take care of one feature. You can develop them independently from each other, orchestrate them into a complete e-commerce system landscape, more or less. We're moving away from this monolithic idea that commerce can do everything, that everything is basically in-house, and that you have to develop and expand directly within that system, because that always had the downside that updates, security updates, in whatever form, were associated with a lot of effort, and maintaining that code was quite a task. This shifts the focus onto individual packages. You can then also split everything up into individual teams. It always depends a bit on the complexity and size of the project, of course, whether it's worth it, but that would be good prerequisite to be able to go down that path. The disadvantages or things where this might not be suitable are, in fact, and Adobe says this themselves, that you really have to look closely. If you have performance, time-critical issues, then you actually prefer to implement those in the PHP core. Yeah, I don't know, database accesses, any price calculations that really need to be fast. Yeah, for example, the topic. The catalog service also has a new price index, so you can shift such things there and not artificially keep them alive in some microservice skeleton. Exactly, those are, in my opinion, the differences. In general, I think you always have to look very closely. There's neither one nor the other. It's extreme, what's only dominant on its own, but it's always going to be a mixed hybrid approach. You say certain features are outsourced, yeah, expanding Adobe Commerce, or even from the outside instead of from the inside. And in my opinion, there are only a few features that will actually be expanded from the inside, so from the core. I think that's how the future will be.
Cool. That's actually it. Thank you very much for the information and the insights. You're welcome. Yeah, for the next visit to Barcelona then, but I'm coming with Mom. Yes.